the Great Tribulation hour coming right up. Let's take a look at what we got here on the most simple thing we're looking at, and we'll get more complicated as we go. We're talking about a 3.5-year period, a Great Tribulation period in the book of Revelation, and we see that same Great Tribulation period in the book of Daniel. And all the terms that are used to describe this Great Tribulation hour, the different terms that are used to describe that time period. And we are looking at something very complex to figure out what is this 3.5-year time period, the Great Tribulation hour. It doesn't matter if you're a pre-tribber or a post-tribber. If you believe in a pre-trib, easy escape rapture idea, most of those think there's a 3.5-year period of Great Tribulation after they're raptured. And if you're a post-tribber, it doesn't matter if you're here on earth or not, you still know that there's a 3.5-year period of Great Tribulation. Where do we get this idea from, right? Now, we know where we get the 7-year period from, that last week of the Daniel prophecy. Many people think that last week comes way into the future, and that 7 years is still coming, and half of that is the Great Tribulation. Well, I don't agree with that teaching, but the half part, the Great Tribulation, the 3.5-year period, is true to both groups, whether you believe in a pre-trib rapture or not. So we're looking at this right here. Let's take a look at this. These are the chapters on the left that talk about a 3.5-year period. Revelation 11, 12, and 13. And down at the bottom left, Daniel has 2 chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 12. You guys see that? Okay. Now on the right are the terms used. The 3.5-year time period is called 3 different things. A 3.5-year time period is called 42 months. It's called 1,260 days. And it's called a time times and half a time. What we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, are all these different terms on the right the same exact 3.5-year time period that is talked about in the 5 chapters on the left? Remember, Daniel's got 2 chapters at the bottom. Is this all one big, gigantic information about one time period? Or are there multiple 3.5-year time periods we're talking about here? Now, see, if you think this is multiple 3.5-year time periods, then there would have to be 7 to 10.5 years of Great Tribulation. And I don't see anybody trying to teach that. I don't see anybody. The pre-tribbers don't teach there's going to be 7 to 10.5 years of Great Tribulation. The post-tribbers don't teach that. I've never seen any scholar or any commentary claim that they say there's a 7-year tribulation, but they say only 3.5 of it is Great Tribulation. You see what I'm saying? So when you get into these different times, these different terms that are used here, there's more than just 2. How can each one be separate? How can all of them be different? That would be 10, 15, 20 years of, Great Tribulation if you separate each one of these terms and how many times each one's used and try to say that each one's different. So that's what we're trying to figure out. Here's what we end up looking at, the different connections that take place. Now, this is a tangly web. Last week, we didn't show the yellow lines because this week we're going to distinguish the difference between what's written in the book, the blue lines, and what we infer from those connections that we can assume in the yellow lines. And we'll get to all this in a minute, and I do not expect anyone to understand this yet. So what we're going to do here is talk about the Great Tribulation using these terms and these chapters. These are the only chapters that talk about it, and these are the only terms that describe it. And they connect like this in the long run, explicitly and implicitly. That means very clearly and simply they connect, and very inferred and logically deduced. They connect with an assumption with the yellow lines. So anyway, I hope that's not too confusing, guys. This is supposed to be the simplest way to look at it. So here we go. Let's get real simple. I showed you the complex way. Let me show you a real simple way. Look, this says simple and fast. You guys ready? Watch how simple this is. And then we're going to go slowly over it in a complex manner. You guys ready? Look at this. Here's a simple way. The 5 chapters, the 4 boxes on the left are the chapters. The terms for the 3.5-year time period are on the right. Now, the first connection is to connect the term a time times and half a time and fit that into these chapters. Where do we read about the time times and half a time in those chapters on the left? And we got a line drawn to chapter 12, chapter 13 of Revelation, Daniel 7 and Daniel 12 in the book of Daniel that actually talk about a time times and half a time, except Revelation 13 does not actually mention a time, times, and half a time, but it's connected by a war. These chapters all have something in common with a time, times, and half a time. In fact, a time, times, and half a time is specifically in character trait with a war in the book of Daniel. The only time a time, times, and half a time is mentioned in the book of Daniel is talking about a war against the saints of God. And that's why Revelation 13 is connected to a time, times, and half a time, because Revelation 13 specifically says there's going to be a war against the saints of God. So that's the first connection. First connection is to connect a time, times, and half a time to the war against the saints. That's the very first thing we have to do. We tried to do that last week, and we read specifically where it was in Daniel and Revelation, and we connected it. And we're going to go over it again today. But right now I'm showing you the quick connections that we need to make in order to understand this right here, which is very complicated. So the very first thing is this right here. This is the very first thing we got to connect. The time, times, and half a time, which is 3.5 years, to these chapters on the left by way of a war against the saints. Each chapter talks about a war against the saints, and each chapter talks about a time period of 3.5 years. So that's your first connection. Now that's the first connection. The second connection is to tie Revelation 12 to 1260 days. Revelation 12 to 1260 days. Revelation 12 talks about a time, times, and half a time, and 1260 days both. That's why that line's connected. We can read about that. It's plain as day written in the Bible. The next connection we see is Revelation 13 to 42 months. Revelation 13 talks about a war with the saints, but it doesn't call it a time, times, and half a time. It calls it 42 months. But it does say it's a war against the saints. So that's why there's a blue line from Revelation 13 over to a time, times, and half a time, because we know there's a connection between these two boxes by the war against the saints. The only difference is with Revelation 13 is that it's not calling that time period a time, times, and half a time. That's a little extra expanded information we're getting. What is it calling it? It's calling it 42 months. So there's your next connection, right? Does everybody understand why we're jumping around like that? We're going to keep going over this because it's a lot to take in, but that's the third connection. Fourth connection is to tie in both terms together. 42 months and 1260 days are both mentioned in Revelation 11. So we draw lines from those boxes over to Revelation 11. And these are the four connections that we're talking about to get to the point where we understand what is explicitly explained without the yellow lines. This does not include the inferred and assumed connections. These are written down. All these connections you see here, we can find something written and connecting each term together. Now, by the time we understand that clearly, we'll understand why all these other lines connect. But you're never going to understand how Revelation 11 connects to a time, times, and half a times when it only mentions 42 months and 1260 days. You're not going to really know that in the beginning until you have gotten it all figured out how each one of these connect first by way of what is written. Does that make sense, guys? First, we got to read what it says clearly, what's written down about these terms and about where the chapters are, and link everything together according to what's written. And then when you understand this part right here that you're looking on, by the time we get to the fourth connection that's written down in the book, you will understand this like the back of your hand. It'll make perfect sense at that time, but you will never understand this until you get to each one of these four connections. Now let's look at it again. We're still learning about the 3.5 year time period, the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. There's four connections that you need to make that are crystal clear written down in the book. Let's look at them. Here's the connections one at a time again. You got this connection here. You have to connect the term a time, times, and half a time to the war against the saints, which is in these four chapters on the left. Remember, there's two chapters at the bottom. Daniel 7 and Daniel 12 are at the bottom. That stands for 2. Okay, so when you make that first connection and nobody can shake your mind about it, nobody can trick you, nobody can fool you, nobody can make you believe that it means something that it doesn't, nobody can make you believe that these don't actually connect, and they try to tell you that there's two different wars. You see, the war is mentioned about 4 times in Scripture. Revelation 12, Revelation 13, Daniel 7, and Daniel 12. There's a war against the saints. You have to ask yourself, is that war 4 different wars about the end times coming against the Christians? Or is this all talking about the same time period where the Antichrist is going to come against the Christians. And see, you have to make your mind up what you're going to believe about that. You guys understand what I'm saying about that? Because if you are not convinced that this war against the saints during this 3.5-year time period is referring to the same war in all these different chapters and the same time period, no matter what it's called in these different chapters, then you're going to be confused and it's going to throw you off. It really will. It'll throw you off. It's a very complex concept. Okay? So here we go. You have to get this one down. We spent time on this and I emphasized it. If you don't understand this part, there's no sense in going any further and trying to understand more complicated layers. So that's the very first connection. The second connection is going to be to connect Revelation chapter 12 to 1260 days. Because in Revelation 12, we get the term a time, times, and half a time. And we get the term 1260 days. Both are mentioned in Revelation 12. That's the second connection over. Now we're going to start seeing God use a different term for the same time period in the same chapter. That's the second connection. The third connection is going to be Revelation 13 to 42 months. How is this connected? Because Revelation 13 talks about what? The war against the saints, which is what? Connected to what? A time, times, and half a time. Except here's the catch. Revelation 13 doesn't call it a time, time, and half a times. It calls that time period 42 months. So you can see that in Revelation 13, we're talking about a war against the saints, which we already established in connection 1, is a time, times, and half a time. According to Daniel and Revelation 12, we put that together already. We understand that that's the same war and the same time period. So when we get to Revelation 13, and it's talking about a war against the saints, except it's calling 3.5 years, 42 months, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that that must be just a different name for it. It's just a different name for the same time period. Now you're going to be asking yourself, why is God changing the names? Why is he using different names? And there is a very crystal clear and good reason for that if you follow along. Just keep on adding to your information little by little. So there's your third connection. Fourth connection, connecting these two terms, which have nothing to do with a time, times, and half a times in terms of the same name. They're different, totally different names. Where do they come together? And seeing how they connect to Revelation 11 is where we're going to find both of those names mentioned. Now, how does that connect to a time, times, and half a time? That's what we're going to figure out. We already saw this, and we saw this. We saw this, and we saw this. You see Revelation 12 connecting to 1260 days? You see Revelation 13 connecting to 42 months? That means these two chapters down here, Revelation 12 and 13, have already been established and already connected to what? A time, times, and half a times. So anything that connects outward from those is going to be automatically connected back to a time, times, and half a times, because we're talking about 3.5 years. 42 months is 3.5 years. 1260 days is 3.5 years. A time, times, and half a times is 3.5 years. So we've made the connection between Revelation 13 to 42 months. We've made the connection from Revelation 12 to 1260 days. And now both of those terms are mentioned in Revelation 11. So the terms mentioned in Revelation 11, we can deduce logically that those are the same time period mentioned in all the other chapters according to the war against the saints. That's the same time period. So these are the quick ways of looking at this. And this is all the connections that we read about in Scripture that we can clearly connect by way of reading the documents in the Bible that God gave us. Okay? With these four connections that are explicitly written, we can infer, that means deduct logically, the other connections by way of these connections. When we understand this, we can make the other inferences of the implicit connections. These right here will fall into place. We will understand, for instance, in Revelation 12, why that's connected to 42 months, when in Revelation 12, you don't read about 42 months. You don't read about 42 months. Well, in Revelation 12, you read about 1260 days, though. So you understand that that time is the same as the 42 months, that when you can infer that. Just like in Revelation 13, you see the yellow line going across over here to 1260 days. Revelation 13 doesn't talk about 1260 days. But when you understand with clarity the connections, when you know that the 42 months that's mentioned in Revelation 13 is the same time period as the 1260 days. How do we know that? Because these two are connected to Revelation 11. And we just showed you, because they're both connected to Revelation 11 as the same time period. That's how we know. 42 months and 1260 days are initiated at the same time in Revelation 11. We're going to read those chapters and verses. We've already read them last week, but that's the quick way we're going to look at that. That's supposed to be quick. But now let's go ahead and look at part 1. And let's go back over part 1, which we did last week. And hopefully you guys are still with me on this. The Great Tribulation, a time of trouble, 3.5 years. This is part 1. We went over it last week, but I told you I'm going to keep going over it until you understand. Great Tribulation is coming. We're talking about 3.5 year time period. Doesn't matter if you believe in pre-trib, post-trib. Everybody believes in a 3.5 year Great Tribulation time period, regardless. Okay, these are the terms that are used. There's 3 different terms: 1260 days, 42 months, a time, times, and half a time. Are they the same time period? That's what we're finding out. Important keys to understand. First thing we have to understand is a time, times, and half a time. What is that? What is a time? Well, we've learned last week, we looked it up, that it can definitely mean, and in these cases, a time is 1 year's worth of time. So 2 times is a times, and half a time is half a year. We've already figured that out last week. We looked up the words. We have to understand the war against the saints. Without understanding the war against the saints, you won't be able to make the first connection. And you have to figure out, is that the same war or not? So these are what we're looking at. Important keys to understand. So the term time, times, and half a time, you have to know what that is. Frontwards, backwards, without a question, without a doubt. You have to know what that is. That's 3.5 years. You have to understand how the war against the saints connects with that 3.5 years. Frontwards, backwards, where it's at in the scriptures, where the verses are, match it from Daniel to Revelation, know exactly where that connects in Revelation 12, and you know that, you master that. There's nobody that can fool you about that. Okay? The second thing, the very important concept that you need to understand is the concept of protection and persecution. We are taught, the pre-tribbers are taught anyway, that there's the first 3.5 years where there's seemingly some protection, and the second 3.5 years is when the Great Tribulation comes. Well, that's because they don't understand the concept of protection and persecution when it comes to a time, times, and half a time. We're going to learn that in Revelation 12, that happens at the same time. We have specific clarity and documentation and empirical proof in written form that these two things happen simultaneously, that there is protection for some and persecution for others at the same time. And without this third key, because these are important keys to understand, we're building upon each part little by little. First, we understand a time times half a time. Then we understand this Antichrist making war against the saints. But then we learn through the scriptures that while the Antichrist is making war against the saints, for that same 3.5 year time period, there is supernatural protection for some people. The 2 witnesses are protected for 3.5 years. The woman fleeing into the wilderness is protected for 3.5 years, while the devil is going to make war with the remnant of her seed. And he kills the other Christians who are not able to hide during the Great Tribulation hour. It's the same war against the saints. So this concept right here is extremely important to understand. Without properly understanding this, we tend to add them together rather than seeing them. What's the word I'm looking for? We put them in sequence rather than synchronizing them. They put the protection before and the persecution after. Therefore, it's 7 years rather than just a simple 3.5 years where they're both taking place. All right. Verse 4 is essential. The concept that the 3.5 year time period is just simply called different names depending on who God is talking to. This blew my mind when God showed me this. Okay? So this 3.5 year time period is called different things, and it's the same exact time period. Now, when you understand that is a principle, you'll understand a lot more those connections in the scriptures. And finally, they all connect to the same time period. But by the time you get to this fourth phase here, you'll know without a shadow of a doubt that this is all talking about the same time period. Okay, now these are the four simple, explicit connections that we showed you earlier, right here. Let me show you again, right here. These are the four simple connections, not these that are inferred once you know the four simple connections. That I call them simple because they're written down and we can see it written down. These connections in yellow are not exactly written down. You have to just have wisdom on that. So when we go over here and we talk about four connections, that's what we're talking about. You see that? There are four simple, explicit connections to understand. And we talked about them one at a time earlier. And this is part one where we only just discussed the first one. So we're going to get into details about this one again, and hopefully you guys will really understand this and we can move on. Okay? So, part one. We did this last week. We're going to go over it again. The four simple, explicit connections to understand about the 3.5-year Great Tribulation hour. The first connection is to understand a time, times, and half a times, and the war against the saints. We have to get that down. So, in the book of Daniel, I'm going to go fast because we already did this. So this is going to go really fast. This all sound familiar if you were here last week. In the book of Daniel, we first see the question, how long shall it be till the end? In Daniel chapter 12, verse 6, you can see it right there in verse 6, how long shall it be until the end? And in Daniel 7 and Daniel 12, we have both. In both chapters, Daniel 7 and Daniel 12, we have the term a time, times, and half a time. This is not two separate time, times, and half a time. Daniel is talking about a war with the saints in chapter 7, and Daniel is talking about a war with the saints in chapter 6. And you have got to understand with clarity that that's the same war in the end times, and the same time, times, and half a time, the same 3.5-year period in both of these chapters. Okay, let's continue. The book of Revelation also talks about a time, times, and half a time. So in the entire Bible, the term a time, times, and half a time is mentioned 3 times. And it's mentioned 3 times for a specific reason. Okay? And it's mentioned in Revelation chapter 12. Now, Revelation chapter 12 is what connects us to Daniel. That's the key to understanding. This first connection is so essential to getting all the other connections right. The 1260 days, the 42 months, chapter 11, chapter 13, connecting it all together. Hey, this is the same time period then. It's this chapter right here. It connects us to Daniel. A time, times, and half a time. And Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12 is the same exact 3.5-year time period. If these were not the same exact 3.5-year time period, you'd be looking at 10.5 years. Who teaches that the Great Tribulation is 10.5 years long? Nobody does. And if you're going to say, well, these two are the same and this one isn't, that doesn't make sense. Who gave you the authority to say which ones are the same and which ones are different? That's guessing. Now, that's an assumption that's not warranted with logic. That's just blind, random guessing. It's logical and very reasonable with all the other evidence to assume properly through what's written that these are all talking about the same. Now, you can assume something radical, you can speculate something radical and far-fetched, or you can build your assumptions on sound logic. That's inference. That's to infer something logically based on the evidence that you have. You can assume. There's nothing wrong with assuming things if you're assuming based on logical, rational research. That's what we do. It's called concluding something. We've concluded. You might say, well, that's not an assumption. Well, that's what you do. You take your assumptions and your hypotheses and you build them on evidence until you're convinced that what you're assuming and what you're believing and what you're thinking is the case is actually the case. So what we see here is a great assumption based on evidence that these are the same exact time period. Okay? Now, you can argue until you're blue in the face with somebody and they might try to show you a bunch of other stuff, but you got to stand your ground. I mean, that's what you do with sound doctrine. You can't, when the Bible says they're blown around by the winds of doctrine, that means they're not stable. You guys understand that? You're not stable if you're blown around by every wind of doctrine, Ephesians chapter 4. You can't make your mind up what you believe. You don't know if that's true or if that's true or if that's true. You can't be that way. You have to say, this is the way it is. I've got plenty of good reason to believe that this is the reason why I believe it. And I've already studied it thoroughly, and I've concluded and assumed and deducted that this is the truth. Okay, let's continue here. All right, now let's take a look at this. A time's time and half a time is mentioned 2 times in the book of Daniel. I told you it was mentioned 3 times altogether, but in the book of Daniel, it's only mentioned twice. Just like 1260 days is mentioned twice, and 42 months is mentioned twice. Each one's mentioned twice, except a times and half a times is mentioned 1 time in the book of Revelation, because that is all that is needed to connect the 2 times it's mentioned in Daniel to all the other phrases are mentioned in the book of Revelation. So in my opinion, it's just the 3rd time that it's brought up is just God giving us the connection point. That's all he's doing. In Revelation 12, he's mentioning a times and half a time, 1 time, to connect the book of Daniel to the book of Revelation. And then he's doubling up on the terms 1260 and 42 to match the double that he spoke about in the book of Revelation. Okay, so here we go. Chapters on the left, Daniel 7 and Daniel 12 are in the 1 box on the bottom, and then the terms for the 3.5 years are on the right. Okay, on the left, on the right. We understand those boxes now. Here's the explicit, simple, clearly written down connections. Here's the complicated inferences that we make and deductions that we can assume that are not clearly written down. And then this is everything together. Okay, I hope you guys are following me. Going back over it again and again is pretty helpful, I think. So here we go. Let's see what we've connected so far. This is part 1, I think. So this is part 1. So we have identified a times and half a time in the book of Daniel, chapter 7 and chapter 12, have we not? And we've connected that to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12 talks about a times and half a time. And in these 2 chapters, or 3 chapters rather, we can read the only places that we read about a times and half a time are in Revelation 12, Daniel 12, Daniel 7. It's mentioned 3 times. Okay, that's the only. So how do we connect everything else? We connect everything else because a times and half a time is a war against the saints. We know that from Daniel. And we're going to read about that coming up in just a moment. And that's why the next thing we need to study is the war against the saints. Otherwise, this is as far as we've gotten with part 1 so far. Okay, everybody with me on part 1? Everybody understand why we've connected a times and half a time to Daniel 7 and 12 and Revelation 12. Everybody gets this part at least. I don't think I need to go over this again next week, at least up into this part. You guys with me? Everybody listening? Okay, so we're gonna study next is the war against the saints, and we're going to connect Revelation 13 that way. Because Revelation 13, you don't see a line here, do you? You don't see a line with Revelation 13. Why? Because Revelation 13 isn't using the actual phrase for the 3.5 years. It's not calling it a times and half a time. So I don't have that connected yet. The way we connect that line to a times and half a time over to Revelation 13 is because we're going to relate it to the war that's talked about in Revelation 12 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 12. Then we get a picture. Oh, that 42 months in 13, Revelation 13, has to be the same 3.5 year time period. So we basically make that connection by what's written down in the book. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go. So next we need to study the war against the saints. To go any further in our connections here, we will see that the war against the saints connects Revelation 12 and 13 to Daniel and a times and half a time. So we haven't gotten that far yet. We will connect it, though, coming up when we read about the war against the saints. Suddenly, it will connect with a times and half a time. So I could have made 5 connections instead of, maybe I'll change this presentation in the future because I'm trying to connect Revelation 13. You know what? I probably should, just to make this even easier and more simple. So this could, in the future, be a separate connection because I'm kind of presenting it that way right now. Like the next thing we need to do is connect this. When I told you that these are all connected. These are really all connected by a war against the saints and a times and half a time. But there's 2 steps to this first connection. So maybe I'll break that down next time. This is the first connection. It just happens to need an extra punch here to bring in 13. To bring in 13, since it doesn't use the term a time, times, and half a time, we need to learn about the war against the saints. Without learning about the war against the saints, we cannot connect 42 months, 1260 days, Revelation 11. Nothing will connect unless we learn about the war against the saints. All right? So that's how we build into this. So all of this will connect eventually. Now the 3 lines to these chapters on the left will connect to a time, times, and half a time when we learn about the war against the saints. That's the only way to connect it. All right? It'll eventually connect with the war against the saints. All of that will be the first connection. So let's examine the passages about the war against the saints. We learned about the time, times, and half a time in Daniel 7 and 12. Well, guess where the war against the saints talked about? Same exact passages, because you cannot separate the two. Give me a 7 if you understand. When you're talking about a time, times, and half a time, you cannot talk about it in separate it from the war against the saints. It's the exact same time period and events in Daniel. When you go read about it in Daniel, when you read about the time, times, and half a time in Daniel, chapter 12 and chapter 7, you will see in the same breath that there's a war against the saints. You cannot separate the two. I did here because I want you to understand what a time, times, and half a time is. Now I'm connecting the reality that it's all about a war against the saints. The Antichrist is going to make war against the saints. So we're going to thicken and richen our understanding here a little bit. All right? So first we have to look at the book of Daniel. Starting in chapter 12, we cannot forget about what Daniel chapter 12 is about. Look what it happens. At that time, what is he talking about in Daniel 12? When shall that time be? When shall that time come to an end? He's talking about the last 3.5 years. A time, times, and half a time. And Daniel 12 says, at that time, Michael's going to stand up, and a time of trouble shall begin that has never been before. That's the Great Tribulation hour that Jesus said. The Great Tribulation's coming in Matthew chapter 24, 21. There shall be great tribulation. When? When Michael stands up. Michael's holding back the enemy. All right? And so these are angelic forces of evil. Okay? The Holy Spirit's got his own job to do in us. And their angelic presences also are battling evil angels and fallen powers and principalities and powers. That's not the job of the Holy Spirit. And that's another Bible study coming up later. We're going to do a Bible study on who's actually holding back the Antichrist later. But in context, Daniel 12, where we read about the war against the saints, where we read about a time, times, and half a time, we read that that's called a time of trouble. And it's coming when Michael moves out of the way from his position of protection. Okay? There, Jesus says that's the time of the Great Tribulation. Then shall be great tribulation. When Michael gets up, stands up out of the way right now, he's standing in the presence, in the way, in the gap, filling in this opening, this opportunity Michael's preventing. Well, when he moves and allows and opens up and casts the devil down to the earth, that war has not taken place yet, the war against Michael's angels and the devil's angels. It's coming here, and when it happens, it's going to be a time of trouble cast down to earth. That's coming. Okay, so first in the book of Daniel, when we read about the war against the saints in Daniel 7, we read about the wearing out the saints in Daniel 7, we read about scatter the power of the holy people in Daniel chapter 12, scatter the power of the holy people. How long shall it be? Daniel 12, a time, times, and half a time. Both chapters are talking about the same exact time period. This is not 7 years of Great Tribulation. It's just 3.5 years. Okay? So here we see a time, times, and half a time is connected to a war against the saints in the book of Daniel. How about Revelation? Next, let's go to Revelation. We read in Revelation 12 about the time, times, and half a time, but here in Revelation 12, verse 13, we see he persecuted the woman. And in Revelation 12, verse 13, and Revelation 12, verse 17, it literally says he makes war against the saints. And we see that same time phrase, a time, times, and half a time. It cannot be a different period. Cannot be logically. It just simply cannot be. Revelation 13 now, how do we bring in Revelation 13? You know what? Let me grab that real quick. I'm on slide 58. I want to come up here and grab that right here because this will be a good place to remind you that we're connecting these two, trying to bring in Revelation 13. So slide 58. Let's come back down here. Okay, remember, we're trying to bring in Revelation 13. Revelation 13 was not brought in yet because it did not mention a time, times, and half a time. So we're trying to connect it. How do we connect it? Now you guys looking, are you guys seeing how I'm connecting this now? See, Revelation 13, we saw, did not mention a time, times, and half a time. Are you guys with me? You guys with me? So how are we bringing it in? Through the war against the saints. Through the war against the saints. Let's look at it. Revelation 13. Here we go. Revelation 13 verse 1. Revelation 13 verse 4. Revelation 13 verse 7. A beast rises up. All right? Power unto the beast. I need to highlight that in Revelation 13:4. Right here. Power was given to the beast. Right? Who is able to make war against him? And it was given to him, look, to make war against the saints. Revelation 13, crystal clear. All right? War against the saints. Revelation 13, how do we bring it in? Revelation 12 and 13, war against the saints. That gives us this right here. I'm going to bring it one more time for clarity. One more time for clarity right here. Boom. How do we bring in chapter 13? Chapter 13 talks about a war against the saints. And even though chapter 13 does not mention the term 3.5 years, it actually calls it 42 months. It's the same time period. We're going to see that in a minute. When you read closer into Revelation 13, you'll see the time he was given was 42 months. We don't see that here yet because I'm getting to that in just a moment. So Revelation 12 and 13 connect by the war against the saints. Now, Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, here's the scriptures, both chapters. Revelation 12, he makes war against the saints. And Revelation 13, he makes war against the saints. Revelation 12, verse 13, he persecuted the woman. It's all the same thing. Here we go. Revelation 12, war against the saints. War against the saints. A time, times, and half a time. He's going to wear out the saints. In Daniel, let me do this. In the book of Daniel, yep, that's Revelation. Here's the book of Daniel. Same terms. Wearing out the saints, scatter the holy people for a time, times, and half a time. How long shall it be? It's all the same time period. Here they are together. Revelation on the right, Daniel on the left, all the chapters, chapter 12, chapter 13 of Revelation, Daniel 7, Daniel 12 on the left, 4 chapters, all talking about a time, times, and half a time and war against the saints. All right, how long shall it be? That's all the same time period, okay? So now we've moved into the connection of bringing in Revelation 13. So it all connects now by a war against the saints. Now, I called this the first connection, when really you can see there's 2 parts to it. You guys see the 2 different parts to this first connection? You really can't bring in Revelation 13 to a time, times, and half a time until you understand the war against the saints. So there's really 2 parts to this first connection. You guys with me? There's really 2 parts to that. This first connection here that we saw earlier is actually 2 parts. So I'm learning as I'm going here. Well, you know what? What I was really trying to do was connect a time, times, and half a time to the war against the saints. So that's why I was calling it one connection. You have to learn about the time, times, and half a time. And then you have to learn about the war against the saints, which is 2 parts, and connect them together to get the first connection. So I'm still learning, guys. Like I said, this is a very, very complicated thing for me to try to teach you guys. I know it up here, but to explain it and articulate it has been quite a challenge. I thought I was going to do it in one weekend, and it's going to take 4 or 5 weeks to really figure it all out. Okay, so back over here. We've made the connection, this connection. Everybody should understand this so far. Everybody should clearly understand why chapter 12 of Revelation, chapter 12 of 13, everybody should understand why Revelation 12, Revelation 13, and the book of Daniel all connect to a war against the saints and a time, times, and half a time. This should be something that you guys should understand. Well, I guess there's a couple different questions I could ask you. First of all, which chapters talk about a time, times, and half a time? And you can see Revelation chapter 12. There's 3 chapters. It's only mentioned 3 times. Or let me say, I could first ask you, how many times is a time, times, and half a time mentioned? How many times in the Bible? You can say 3. How many times is it mentioned in the Old Testament? 2. How many times is it mentioned in the New Testament? 1. I want you guys to know what chapters those are in. I want you guys to know what chapters you know in the book of Revelation that a time, times, and half a time is in chapter 12. Daniel 12 too. So you got two 12s right there. How many of you can remember Daniel chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12? And then all you got to do is remember Daniel chapter 7. Those are the three places that a time, time, and half a time is mentioned. Now the war against the saints brings in what chapter? Chapter 13, Gerhard. You got it, buddy. But yes, let's look at this again. Remember, we're bringing in chapter 13. We're trying to bring in chapter 13, don't forget. We're trying to bring in chapter 13 to this connection here. And the only way to bring in chapter 13 is to understand the war against the saints. Chapter 13 does not mention a time, times, and half a time, but it talks about 42 months. Well, how do you know 42 months is the same as a time, time, and half a time? Because it talks about, the key is it talks about a war against the saints. That is called studying. That's called understanding. That's called discernment. That's called wisdom. And I'm not saying I'm super smart. I'm saying we all are getting it. We're all getting it. Which chapters talk about the time, times, and half a time? These two chapters and this chapter talks about a time. Look, well, you see the connections right here. That's what these two lines are for. That's what that line is. And that's what that line is. Except down here, there's two chapters. There's two chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 12. We're learning about the Great Tribulation hour in the Bible. We're learning about where it talks about a 3.5-year time period in the Old Testament. We're learning what that 3.5-year time period is going to look like. We see a great war against God's people. Okay? We're coming into this hour. Okay? This is why we're studying this. There's a promise of a blessing to whoever studies the book of Revelation. This isn't about being smart or looking better or having knowledge. This is about getting a blessing. I think the blessing partially is going to be we're ready to get our heads chopped off when nobody else is. Okay? I'm hoping that that's going to be part of the blessing that we get, that we're just simply not going to be scared to starve to death. We're not going to be scared for the lions to rip us apart, okay? You know? We're not going to be scared. Supernatural grace is going to come upon us right when we need it at the right second, and we're going to be blessed. So some people, they don't put the time into this. They don't care about this stuff, you know? Okay, let's continue to figure this out slowly but surely. And I'm glad we're going over this again because now it's all starting to make sense. Okay, so here we are. We finally brought in Revelation 13 because there's a war against the saints, the same war against the saints that's talked about in Revelation 12 and in Daniel 7 and 12, Daniel at the bottom. So now we see how this is all connected. And I'm going to bring this back up because I want to copy this. We made the first connection. Copy. All right, this is a good place to pop this chart in. I didn't have that there before. We made the first connection. Let me highlight this. There we go. Now let me make it blue. There we go. Okay, so we just made the first connection right there. All right? I'm just thinking that, you know, if we go any further, we might forget what we just learned. Now, this is all we did last week. And you can see going over it again this week. Now it's starting to stick a little bit more, but man, you know, it's hardcore. I mean, I'm not a rocket scientist, PhD scholar type. It takes me a long time to go over things before I learn it seems. But when I learn it, like I'm finally getting it, like I'm really getting it now. I'm not the fastest, brightest, sharpest tool in the shed, but when you go over something long enough, guys, when you go over it long enough and you focus on it long enough, it starts to make sense. And this is one of those things you cannot go too quickly for. So let's continue. This is part one. We're almost done with part one. This is the end of part one. This is the first connection. Okay, that's all we were doing. This whole presentation was building into this very first connection, and we've just about finished it here. So the connection in part one is we start with a time, times, and half a time, and we read about it in these chapters here, these three chapters, that one term, a time, times, and half a time, Daniel 12, Revelation 12, and Daniel 7, those three chapters in the Bible that talk about a time, times, and half a time. And then we learn about a war against the saints that's connected to that time, times, and half a time. And then we can see that same war in Revelation 13. excuse me, I think I'm going to like this a little bit better. I want to tidy this up a little bit better. Yeah, let's do this. I just made these slides today and I like them better. So let's see what we got here. Down a little further. So here we go. Yeah, I think I'm going to use this one. I like these better. All right, so these are the connections we made so far. Bringing in chapter 13 by the war against the saints. So this concludes part one. I'm going to finish this up a little bit neater here, but that's the end. This concludes part one. We went over part one last week. We're going over it again this week. So all we've connected is a time times and half a time with the 4 chapters, and then a time times half a time connects to these 4 chapters, even though it's only mentioned in 3 chapters. It connects to Revelation 13 by a war against the saints, which is called 42 months, which we're going to get into next. See, this next connection, we've got to bring in the 1260-day connection. That's coming up next. So that I'm not going to even go into that right now. The 1260 days is coming up next. Okay. Let's take a look at this. So that's all we've connected so far. We still got that to go. And as a matter of fact, it might not be a bad idea for me to go back over this simple connection with you guys again. Here's the blanks page. Here's what we learned so far. Now, next we're going to learn connection 2 is bringing in. So you see how 12 is already connected. So if 12 is already, any of these boxes over here on the left that are connected, all talk about a 3.5 year time period. So anything that connects to these 3 boxes on the left, no matter what it's called, is going to be the same time period. That's just the way it is. So chapter 12 connects to a time times and half a time because it says a time times and half a time in the chapter. And it also talks about 1260 days. So that's the next connection. Then after that, we're going to learn that the war against the saints in Revelation 13, which was connected right here already, is going to connect up here to 42 months. So it's already connected to this time period here, but by the war, because there's a war against the saints in that chapter, but it calls it 42 months. And that's why we're going to be able to bring in 42 months. And then eventually, in Revelation 11, we see both terms. It's the only chapter that uses 42 months and 1260 days, and it describes a time period of protection and power given to the Antichrist people to trodden down the temple. So that's all going to come up, coming up soon. And that's how all this connects. What we just saw in those 4 connections is explained right here. Everything connects by something written down and clearly written in the book. So this is the explicit connections. And with these 4 connections, when we understand them, we'll be able to understand these right here. Daniel 7 and Daniel 12 do not talk about 42 months, nor do they talk about 1260 days. Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 12 only talks about a time times and half a time. And that's why we got a blue line drawn over here to that time period. But we know from all the other connections that the 42 months is indeed the same time period. That's why there's a yellow line. It's inferred that. Does everybody follow me on the inferences? If you can follow me on these yellow lines, then you're learning a lot more than you realize. And see, Daniel chapter 12 right here, Daniel chapter 12 and Daniel chapter 7, does not mention 1260 days. It only mentions a time and half a time. But we've learned from the connection in Revelation 12 that mentions a time and half a time, it also mentions 1260. So we can infer that the time down here in Daniel 12, which is a time and half a time, we connected a yellow line up to 1260, even though it doesn't clearly say that. We know that that's still the same time period. That's why it's a yellow line, because it's not clearly written. It's basically inferred or suggested or understood. It's understood that that's the same time period.